By mid-1945, the port of Tsingtao, Qingdao, stood at the intersection of collapsing empires and resurgent Chinese forces. Once a German leasehold from 1898, besieged and captured by Japan in 1914, returned to Chinese sovereignty in 1922, and occupied again by Japan in 1938, the city's layered past shaped every decision taken in the war's closing months. Its deep-water anchorage, repair yards, cable stations, and rail links to Jinan and the North China Plain made it a strategic keystone for whoever controlled Shandong's coast. Japan's North China Command treated Tsingtao as a naval air hub to protect sea lanes along the Yellow Sea and to support security operations. Inland coastal batteries from pre-war and wartime programs guarded the approaches. Concrete revetments, tunnels, and magazines ringed the hills east of the city. Airfields at Jiaocheishan and nearby strips hosted patrol aircraft late in the war. The Army presence focused on lines of communication to the interior, coordinated with naval base units and collaborationist police. By summer 1945, fuel scarcity and attrition had reduced operational tempo, but defensive works and stocks remained in place. In Chongqing, the nationalist government identified Tsingtao, Tianjin, and Shanghai as priority ports for re-entry after Japan's capitulation. The intention was twofold: accept the Japanese surrender and reassert central authority along the coast to anchor subsequent inland operations. Staff work planned air-sea lift of advance parties, with follow-on echelons to secure railheads and warehouses. Intelligence estimated that urban garrisons would comply with surrender orders, but warned of dispersed Japanese detachments and armed auxiliaries beyond the perimeter. Communist forces in Shandong, organized under the East China Command, viewed Tsingtao as the terminus of supply routes that could enable nationalist concentrations in the province. Their assessments emphasized the city's limited landward exits, the dependence on maritime logistics, and the opportunity to pressure the hinterland while avoiding costly urban assaults. Political departments prepared to mobilize port workers and rural associations for information, labor, and food collection should a contest for control unfold. The United States, executing Allied policy for Japanese disarmament and repatriation, planned to move Marine divisions and naval units into select ports to facilitate order and reception of surrendered materiel. Tsingtao's harbor and facilities made it suitable for anchoring transports, cruisers, and auxiliaries tasked with demobilization duties. Washington's guidance prioritized preventing clashes between Chinese factions within Allied occupation zones, while expediting the return of Japanese personnel. Local civilians, dockers, railway staff, merchants, and brewery workers absorbed the uncertainty. Wartime shortages, requisitions, and air raid precautions had altered daily routines. Rumors of imminent surrender circulated alongside concerns about food prices, employment, and reprisals. Coastal villages assessed fishing grounds mined or interdicted. Inland market towns tracked troop movements and road conditions on the Jiaozhou Bay Rim. Thus, at the threshold of August and September 1945, Tsingtao presented multiple, sometimes conflicting, strategic motivations. A fortified Japanese hub awaiting orders from Tokyo, a vital re-entry point for nationalists, a target to be encircled rather than stormed by communist planners, and an Allied anchorage for disarmament operations. Each actor entered the final phase with distinct assumptions about compliance, timelines, and civilian cooperation, setting the stage for the opening moves that would test those estimates. On 15 August 1945, the Imperial General Headquarters transmitted the order to cease operations. Garrisons at Tsingtao acknowledged receipt and were instructed to hold positions, safeguard stores, and await Allied and Chinese directions. Naval base personnel inventoried coastal guns, ammunition dumps, and signal stations around Jiaozhou Bay, while Army units re-established checkpoints on the rail line to Jinan to prevent looting. Command posts prepared detailed returns of personnel, weapons, and fuel, anticipating inspections after the formal surrender scheduled in Tokyo. In Chongqing, nationalist headquarters issued directives to accept the surrender of Japanese forces in North China and to reoccupy principal ports. Advance parties composed of staff officers, interpreters, and logistics officers were assembled to move by air and sea once shipping became available. Orders prioritized control of customs, telecommunications, and rail yards to restart port throughput. Provincial affiliates were told to coordinate with Allied liaison missions and to avoid premature entries that might trigger clashes with local forces. Communist commands in Shandong responded by concentrating detachments along the approaches to the city, establishing observation posts on the road net running from Qingdao's hinterland to Lixi and Jimo Field. Reports counted Japanese positions that remained intact and documented locations of collaborationist police stations. Political teams instructed village committees to preserve warehouses and docks from stripping, while preparing grain levees and transport animals for expected operations. The stated aim was to secure the countryside, gather intelligence, and shape conditions before nationalist units could arrive in strength. United States planning shifted from combat to occupation tasks. Naval officers surveyed North China ports suitable for receiving transports carrying disarmament teams, and Marine Infantry Tsingtao's wharves, repair yards, and anchorage depth placed it on the early list. Signals went out to assemble interpreters, civil affairs specialists, and ordnance personnel to supervise weapons collection, and mine-clearing command guidance emphasized maintaining order during the transition and preventing engagements between Chinese factions inside the port precincts. In the city, Japanese administrators reopened ration offices under Allied orders, using pre-war registers to organize distributions. Factory managers at ship repair shops and breweries tallied workforces and power requirements in expectation of inspections. Urban police, still under Japanese command pending handover, patrolled markets to deter black market sales of military stores. Civilian committees petitioned for restoration of tram service and repair of damaged water mains to stabilize daily life. From late August into September, reconnaissance and liaison accelerated. Japanese officers briefed Chinese and Allied visitors on minefields at the harbor entrance and the status of coastal artillery magazines near Laoshan. Nationalist emissaries enumerated conditions for local compliance: no transfer of arms to third parties, preservation of port assets, and readiness to hand over maps and codes. Communist delegations pressed for custody of rural depots and requested joint panels to receive outlying surrenders. These proposals were recorded but not implemented pending higher-level settlements. The formal Japanese capitulation on September 2nd set the administrative sequence in motion. Orders designated Tsingtao as a reception point for repatriation shipping and for the collection of naval materiel. Allied dispatches confirmed that Chinese nationalist forces would accept the surrender on shore. With Allied naval support, offshore Japanese commanders consolidated their troops into fewer cantonments to facilitate counting and reduce patrols to fixed posts under curfew, reporting daily to liaison officers. By late September, coastal batteries remained sealed, port cranes were inspected, and airfields were pegged for limited operations to support landings. Chinese newspapers carried announcements that nationalist troops and Allied units were en route, while communist bulletins claimed control of rural districts beyond the urban perimeter. The opening phase thus produced a fragile arrangement: a garrison under orders to stand fast, 2 Chinese forces positioning to claim authority, and Allied contingents preparing to enter the harbor to supervise disarmament and the transfer of control. Nationalist planners framed 3 primary objectives for Tsingtao: accept the Japanese surrender in place, re-establish central government control of customs and communications, and open a coastal gateway to sustain army concentrations in Shandong. Staff tables allocated advanced echelons of infantry, military police, and technical services to seize the harbor office, cable station, radio nodes, and rail yards. Follow-on echelons were tasked to guard warehouses, repair cranes, and restore coal and power to dry docks. Supply lines were mapped from ocean transports through bonded stores to rail lifts moving inland toward Jinan. Assumptions included orderly Japanese compliance and limited resistance from local militias once salaries and rations resumed. Communist headquarters set complementary but conflicting goals: deny exclusive nationalist control of the port's landward approaches, integrate rural surrenders into base area stockpiles, and shape any transfer of authority through negotiated evacuations rather than formal parades. Planning memoranda assigned columns to road interdiction belts northwest and northeast of the city, emphasizing bridges, culverts, and gradient turns on the coastal plain. Logistics officers organized grain levies, salt shipments, and draft animals to maintain endurance on secondary roads if the main railway corridors became guarded. Propaganda teams prepared leaflets for port workers, highlighting wage arrears, food prices, and pledges against reprisals to secure informants and labor sympathies. Japanese commanders wrote parallel plans constrained by capitulation terms. Naval and Army staffs scheduled serial inventories of weapons, ammunition, and mines, sorted by caliber and storage site, with sealed magazines under joint guard to meet Allied inspection requirements. They projected personnel concentration into cantonments close to the harbor to reduce disorder, supported by ration depots that could feed both uniformed personnel and attached laborers. Hydrographic detachments compiled annotated charts of shoals, swept channels, and suspected mine lines at the bay entrance to pass to Allied mine-sweeping units. A standing order prohibited disposal of records or the transfer of arms to any Chinese force. United States naval and marine planners defined a limited mission set: supervise the surrender and disarmament of Japanese forces, secure port facilities to accelerate repatriation shipping, and prevent clashes between Chinese formations within the operational perimeter. A regimental combat team was configured as the initial landing force, with detachments of communications, civil affairs, and ordnance specialists. Shipping schedules paired attack transports and cargo vessels with landing craft, sufficient to put inspection parties on piers and to offload vehicles and engineering equipment. Fuel and rations were forecast for self-sustainment to avoid drawing on local stocks during the first weeks. Doctrinally, nationalist plans assumed that visibility and ceremony would consolidate authority. Flag raising at customs, press notices of reopened telegraph lines, and quick tax receipts at the harbor master's office. Communist doctrines stressed dispersal and cumulative pressure, aiming to dominate the countryside with checkpoints and ambush-capable platoons while engaging urban unions and market guilds. Japanese doctrine shifted to custodial control, using pre-war municipal frameworks to keep services running until relieved Allied doctrine emphasized neutrality between Chinese parties, while imposing strict control over Japanese materiel and movements. Preparation exposed vulnerabilities. Nationalist lift capacity depended on Allied shipping priorities assigned across multiple North China ports, creating sequencing risk if weather or minefields delayed convoys. Communist logistics relied on grain collection during a lean season and on road networks degraded by wartime neglect, constraining sustained concentrations near the city. Japanese stockpiles of fuel and medical supplies were finite and sized for a garrison under siege conditions, not months of static compliance feeding large numbers. Allied assumptions about rapid mine clearance hinged on accurate charts and cooperative pilots. Miscalculations appeared in intelligence estimates. Nationalist files overcounted the willingness of collaborationist police to shift allegiance without guarantees of pay and protection. Communist summaries underestimated the speed with which Allied detachments could establish pierhead control, limiting access to waterfront labor. Japanese returns understated small arms caches in outlying police boxes, later uncovered during joint inspections. Allied briefings discounted the political competition for municipal jobs that would follow any handover of utilities and transport. Each actor mounted information campaigns to shape the environment. Nationalist newspapers printed schedules for reopening rail departures and customs processing to signal normality. Communist radio broadcasts from rural stations announced tax reductions on salt and grain if communities cooperated with depot handovers. Japanese notices in Chinese and Japanese fixed curfew hours, ration scales, and reporting procedures. Allied releases in English and Chinese specified surrender protocols, weapons turn-in points, and penalties for interference with disarmament. By late September, the planning cycle converged on execution timetables, Allied shipping windows, Japanese inventory deadlines, nationalist reception parties assigned to specific piers and warehouses, and communist movement orders to tighten control of the roads beyond the urban edge. The city remained quiet, but taut, with objectives, routes, and lists finalized on paper, while implementation awaited the first Allied signal to begin landings at the harbor. In early October 1945, Allied transports entered Jiaozhou Bay under Japanese pilotage. Minesweepers cleared approach lanes, while liaison boats took soundings against charts compiled by naval hydrographers. At the main pier, inspection parties verified that coastal batteries were sealed and that ammunition magazines on Laoshan spurs were locked and inventoried. A Marine regimental landing team put companies ashore to cordon the docks, customs house, and radio stations. Engineers checked cranes, power feeds, and hydrant lines. Japanese guards remained at their posts until relieved, then marched to designated cantonments for counting and disarmament. Nationalist advance parties followed onto the piers to establish offices for surrender processing. Interpreters read terms requiring registration of personnel, stacking of small arms, and detailed turnover of codes and maps. Checkpoints funneled Japanese officers to tables where weapon tallies, unit rosters, and warehouse keys were recorded. Within 48 hours, Allied ordnance detachments began collecting machine guns, mortars, and radios into fenced compounds. Air service teams inspected the field at Changkou, logging runway conditions, fuel stocks, and the disposition of aircraft parts. Beyond the urban perimeter, communist detachments tightened their ring on the road net. Platoon-sized posts went up at bridgeheads toward Jimo and Lakesea, with roadblocks built from cart axles and railroad ties. The first clashes were brief. Patrols intercepted collaborationist police moving to the coast with ledgers and cash boxes. In several cases, escorts surrendered the records while keeping sidearms under promises of later amnesty reviews. Reports noted isolated shots fired near culverts and toll stations, but no sustained firefights. Control of villages shifted through meetings rather than assaults, with local committees pledging to prevent looting of depots and to guide traffic away from guarded routes. Inside the city, the immediate engagements were administrative. Customs reopened with combined nationalist Allied oversight. Inspectors sealed bonded warehouses containing textiles, metals, and foodstuffs. Japanese municipal managers handed over tram schedules, ration books, and waterworks diagrams. Port workers' representatives asked for back wages and rice allotments. Nationalist officials announced temporary scales pegged to pre-war grades, while communist broadcasts in surrounding counties advertised grain prices and tax remissions to draw labor and information outward. The arms handover revealed uneven compliance. Central depots produced full crates of rifles and ammunition, according to inventory sheets, but outlying police boxes turned in mixed lots, some with complete racks, others with gaps explained as lost during air raids or issued to patrols not yet returned. Allied teams cross-checked serial numbers. Discrepancies triggered follow-up searches that uncovered pistols hidden in office ceilings and carbines cached under coal in service yards. The Japanese garrison cooperated under orders, but liaison logs recorded occasional refusals by individuals later disciplined by their commanders. At sea, the first convoys of repatriation vessels were scheduled, requiring the harbor to sequence pier space between disarmament consignments and outgoing Japanese personnel. This created friction over storage. Nationalist quartermasters needed sheds for incoming supplies, while Allied ordnance required secure bays for collected weapons. A compromise split the waterfront by function, with marked lanes for each flow and a curfew bell to clear the quays at night. Tally clerks noted throughput targets in tons per day, and Marine police enforced one-way circulation to reduce pilferage. Terrain exerted pressure on all parties. The narrow coastal plain limited maneuver, concentrating checkpoints at predictable choke points. Rain softened secondary roads, slowing communist columns that sought to reposition without exposing themselves to observation from the bay. Within the city, steep hills overlooking the harbor gave survey teams vantage points, but also demanded additional sentries to prevent unauthorized signaling. Japanese charts identified suspected mine lines outside the swept channel. Allied craft kept to buoyed corridors until clearance certificates extended farther south. Morale shifted unevenly. Japanese ranks stabilized under routine, roll calls, ration distribution, medical inspections, while uncertainty over the length of internment persisted. Nationalist detachments reported confidence tied to visible symbols. Flag hoists at customs and regular train departures to the interior as rail crews returned. Communist reports emphasized growing village cooperation and listed volunteers for porterage and messenger duty. Civilians measured change by prices. Rice, coal, and lamp oil fluctuated as controls resumed and black market stockpiles surfaced. By mid-October, a de facto line existed, urban Tsingtao under nationalist administration with Allied supervision and Japanese units in cantonment, rural approaches under communist checkpoints and patrols, coastal waters under Allied minesweeping and harbor control. The first engagements had produced limited gunfire, but decisive administrative and territorial sorting. Each side now held leverage, piers and paperwork inside the port, roads and grain outside it, setting conditions for the next phase, when reinforcement schedules, supply endurance, and competing claims over municipal authority would test the fragile balance. Reinforcements began to shape outcomes rather than announcements. Additional marine detachments expanded the cordon from the piers to the oil tanks and dry docks. Shore parties established ammunition points and a field hospital near the waterfront. Nationalist transports offloaded infantry companies, military police, and railway engineers. Guard posts multiplied at the customs house, power plant, and cable station. Schedules assigned platoons to the tram depot and waterworks, while engineers strung field telephones from the harbor master's office to the main police precincts. A ration plan issued rice and salt to dock crews in exchange for fixed shifts on cranes and winches. On the landward side, communist columns deepened control along the Liexi and Jimo corridors. Roadblocks moved from temporary carts to dug-in posts with trenches across verges and ditches. Scouts mapped culverts and gradients for potential demolitions. Supply bureaus organized grain levies by village population and ox teams by distance to the forward line. Liaison officers met market guilds to regulate food shipments into the city, introducing passes that limited cartloads to specified weights. Reports noted growing cooperation from rural shopkeepers in exchange for protection from bandits and for standardized prices. Friction rose at predictable choke points. A nationalist convoy moving cement and spare rails encountered a communist checkpoint north of a bridge. Escorts insisted on passage to repair storm damage inside the city, while checkpoint leaders demanded inspection and a portion of cargo for rural depots. After an exchange of warnings, both sides called in superiors. The convoy was allowed through with sealed wagons, but 2 carts were detached for local use under a receipt. Similar incidents occurred at toll gates and ferry slips. Shots were fired in several cases when sentries misread signals at dusk. Brief exchanges ended as officers intervened. Casualty lists remained short but cumulative, recorded in separate ledgers without public release. Japanese cantonments became administrative pivot points. Daily musters verified headcounts against surrender rosters. Medical officers treated dysentery and influenza as crowded barracks, strained sanitation. Ordnance teams stacked rifles by serial number and crated machine guns, while artillery breech blocks were tagged and stored. Hydrographers accompanied Allied boats to verify buoy positions. After storms, shifted markers. Compliance held, but diaries recorded anxiety over repatriation, dates as rumors circulated about shipping priorities among North China ports. International coordination tightened. Allied harbor control issued standardized movement windows for lighters, minesweepers, and repatriation transports. A joint nationalist Allied board scheduled pier allocations by hour, weapons collection, cargo for municipal services, and embarkation of Japanese personnel. The board's minutes recorded disputes over storage sheds, resolved by assigning separate warehouses and guards. Notices in Chinese, English, and Japanese set curfew times, pier access badges, and penalties for pilfering. A postal detachment reopened registered mail with censorship protocols to intercept military documents leaving the city. Weather and terrain complicated execution. Autumn rains flooded low stretches of the coastal plain, forcing detours that extended travel times by hours. Mud reduced handcart throughput. Requisitioned draft animals suffered sores, lowering daily haulage. In the hills overlooking the bay, observation posts required additional rations and fuel as winds exposed sentries. Inside the port, salt air corroded cables and switchgear left unmaintained during the final months of the war, slowing restoration of crane capacity. Politics pressed into logistics. Nationalist civil administrators posted hiring notices for municipal jobs with preference for pre-war employees, aiming to stabilize services and outpace rival appointments. Communist committees issued letters guaranteeing safety for technicians willing to work in rural power substations and mills. Competing wage scales emerged. The city offered fixed rice equivalents per day, plus housing vouchers. The countryside promised grain shares indexed to harvest results and exemptions from cart levies. Laborers weighed travel risks against the reliability of pay and rations. Civilians negotiated uncertainty through practical adjustments. Fishers requested charts of cleared lanes to resume coastal trips. Permission slips limited departures to daylight hours. Brewery managers restarted boilers at reduced capacity, reporting coal shortages and valve failures. Engineers scavenged parts from idle locomotives with Allied approval. School principals reopened classes with interim textbooks, compiled from pre-war stock and handwritten supplements. Market prices stabilized for several weeks, then rose again when storms delayed convoys and when rural authorities tightened controls on outflow. Information contests intensified. Nationalist bulletins highlighted reopened train departures and telephone exchanges. Communist broadcasts listed bridges under People's Protection and announced courts to adjudicate collaboration cases outside the city. Allied communiques reiterated that Japanese weapons would be collected exclusively by designated teams and warned against unauthorized seizures. Japanese camp orders stressed discipline, curfews, and readiness to move when shipping arrived. By late October, the crisis had escalated without a decisive clash. More troops on piers and in alleys, more checkpoints on roads, more rules governing the movement of grain, coal, and paperwork. The port functioned under layered control, nationalist administration with Allied oversight, and the hinterland under a widening rural network directed by communist headquarters. Each side measured progress in tonnage moved, posts established, and offices opened, while civilians measured it in hours, waited for rice, tram intervals, and the distance one could travel before facing another search. The balance held but grew more brittle as reinforcement schedules and harvest timetables converged, raising the cost of miscalculation for all parties. The campaign reached its operational peak when multiple timelines converged. Allied repatriation convoys, nationalist reinforcement waves, and communist efforts to seal the roads. For 48 hours before the first large embarkations, Allied harbor control declared a restricted zone from the main pier to the buoyed channel. Minesweepers extended cleared lanes. Signal parties installed temporary range lights. Tugs staged along the quays to rotate lighters. Without idle time, marine companies expanded the dockside cordon to the fuel tanks and ore sheds. Shore patrols synchronized pier passes with cargo schedules to prevent bottlenecks. Nationalist headquarters ordered a citywide sweep for weapons, radio sets, and uniforms. Police and military police teams, paired with interpreters, moved block by block through the inner districts and along the tramline search protocols, called for inventory of basements, attics, and service yards. Seized items were tagged, logged, and trucked to fenced compounds at designated warehouses. At the airfield, engineering detachments repaired runway edges and reactivated lighting for night movements tied to convoy timetables, Railway battalions relayed damaged sleepers at the freight yard to carry coal and military cargo inland. Communist columns executed their largest interdiction plan to date. Checkpoints multiplied at bridges and causeways. Roving patrols shadowed convoys, counting vehicles and estimating loads. Field reports confirmed the diversion of some carts from grain markets into rural depots, and road guards issued time-stamped passes to regulate flow toward the city. At several culverts and steep gradients, sapper teams emplaced obstacles intended to force inspections and delays, rather than demolitions that would require major repairs. Political sections convened village assemblies to formalize grain quotas and to assign porters for forward posts. Japanese cantonments hit maximum throughput under the disarmament schedule. Rifles were stacked in long files by manufacturer and serial range. Machine guns, mortars, and radios were crated and sealed. Artillery breech blocks were checked against lists compiled earlier. Medical sections processed hundreds daily for inoculations and transport clearance. Hydrographers rode pilot boats to confirm the newest buoy locations after winds shifted markers overnight. The garrison maintained curfews and muster reports while preparing embarkation rosters aligned to ship berths. Civilian life compressed around the surge. Tram intervals lengthened as lines were diverted to carry dock workers. Markets opened earlier and closed at dusk to clear streets for cargo columns. Port committees issued meal chits redeemable at canteens to stabilize labor during extended shifts. Hospitals stocked dressings and disinfectants against accidents on the quays. Schools shortened classes to free older students for messenger duty. Notices in 3 languages warned against approaching cordoned areas and listed penalties for pilferage and unauthorized photography. The most intense frictions occurred at the interface of pier and road. A nationalist convoy moving spare rails and signal cable arrived at a checkpoint outside the urban boundary, where communist guards required offloading for inspection. After negotiations by liaison officers, sealed wagons passed under escort, while a portion of handcart cargo was diverted under receipt for rural depots. In 2 separate nighttime incidents inside the city, sentries fired warning shots when workers attempted to bypass barricades with sacks of coal. No fatalities were recorded, but patrols tightened curfews on adjacent streets. Along an inland causeway, a brief exchange of fire broke out when a patrol challenged a group escorting collaborationist officials to the coast. The group dispersed, leaving ledgers that were later entered into municipal files. High command decisions reflected the strain. Nationalist authorities prioritized holding the customs house, power plant, and rail yards even if neighborhood sweeps had to be curtailed. Communist headquarters directed columns to avoid fixed fights near the city, to maintain pressure on crossings, and to keep grain moving to forward depots. Allied staff enforced pier allocations by hour, repatriation first, disarmament, cargo second, municipal supplies third. To meet shipping windows, Japanese commanders concentrated personnel closer to embarkation piers to reduce marching times and to simplify counts. Logistics defined success and limits. Harbor throughput hit its planned ceiling as lighters cycled between transports and sheds. Ordnance compounds reached capacity with crated materiel. Cold storage failed in one warehouse, forcing rapid redistribution of perishables. Outside the city, saturated roads and soft shoulders slowed carts and animal teams. Depot clerks recalculated quotas to reflect losses to mud and broken axles. Coal deliveries to the power plant fluctuated with convoy delays, producing rolling outages that interrupted crane operations until auxiliary generators were fueled and tested. Morale and discipline were tested but held. Allied military police recorded detentions for theft and curfew violations. Nationalist units reported fatigue among search details working extended shifts. Communist reports noted desertions from collaborationist units trying to change sides. Japanese diaries described routine inspections and rumors about embarkation dates. Civilian petitions requested fixed rice rations, predictable tram service, and compensation for requisitioned carts. By the end of the peak interval, measurable outcomes accumulated. Piers cleared successive embarkations, weapons stockpiles were centralized and sealed. urban utilities operated under guarded schedules. Rural checkpoints controlled most land access to the city. The port functioned at maximum capacity under layered oversight, while the hinterland remained under a tightening belt of road control. No decisive battle decided the balance, but the largest, most coordinated operations of all parties had unfolded simultaneously. Exhausting reserves of fuel, labor, and patience and setting conditions for either a negotiated accommodation or a sharper confrontation in the next phase. Adaptation unfolded on every line of effort. Nationalist authorities reorganized urban defense from static posts to layered zones around the customs house, power plant, cable station, and rail yards. Patrols shifted to irregular schedules to reduce predictability. Escort details paired rifle squads with electricians and crane operators to secure work sites against theft and sabotage. Convoy discipline tightened. Vehicles moved in chalked serials with manifest copies at head and tail. Handcarts were grouped by ward to ease accounting at checkpoints. Ammunition issue was capped for routine duties, with sealed boxes opened only on written orders to limit accidental discharges during crowded inspections. Communist commands adapted to the urban cordon by widening control laterally rather than pushing directly into the city. Night movement replaced daylight marches. Guides led files along levees and field paths to avoid roadblocks. Village depots standardized grain sacks by weight-to-speed audits. Porter teams rotated by fixed hours to maintain endurance on long carries. Ambush plans emphasized capture of documents and tools rather than destruction of cargo that would be needed later. Political officers expanded literacy classes at forward posts to train clerks capable of keeping ledgers for taxes, rations, and passes, enabling a more durable administrative presence. Japanese cantonments balanced compliance with preservation. To reduce disease in crowded barracks, medical officers instituted daily inspections, lime treatment of latrines, and staggered meal times. Work details under Allied supervision repaired pier decking, cleared debris from sheds, and sorted scrap. Each party carried printed passes listing hours and tasks to prevent misunderstandings with patrols. Officers compiled unit histories, equipment lists, and map annotations requested by inspectors, treating meticulous records as a form of proof against accusations and as a contribution to orderly repatriation. Allied forces adjusted procedures as traffic increased. Harbor Control introduced color-coded pier badges linked to specific time windows. A separate lane was painted for lighters carrying medical cases. Mine-sweeping officers adopted a sweep-and-mark pattern that left temporary buoys in suspected shoal areas until confirmation runs could be made at high and low water. Marine shore patrols established summary violation logs and posted translated extracts of regulations at tram stops and markets to reduce disputes. Civil affairs teams opened a claims desk where civilians could file for compensation for requisitioned carts and accidental damage, with receipts verified against unit property books. Innovation in resource management emerged from necessity. The power plant used the brewery's boilers to stabilize steam supply during maintenance on cracked tubes. Tram workshops cannibalized idle cars to keep one line operating to the docks. The cable station re-terminated sections using salvage connectors. Nationalist railway battalions cut new drainage ditches beside the freight yard to reduce washouts, while communist road guards installed plank causeways over sodden stretches to keep porter routes functional. Fisher cooperatives refitted hulls with reinforced ribs to carry heavier loads along cleared inshore lanes when roads were impassable. Information control evolved into a steady contest. Nationalist notices standardized wage tables for port work and published surrender protocols to undercut rumors. Communist broadcasts listed rural courts and appeal procedures for collaboration cases to draw informants from the city outskirts. Allied bulletins reiterated penalties for interfering with disarmament and explained the schedule for repatriation sailings to defuse speculation about favoritism. Japanese camp orders required attendance at briefings on embarkation procedures and warned against bartering uniforms or kit outside designated exchanges. The psychological toll registered in diaries, police logs, and medical reports. Nationalist units recorded fatigue and requested shorter night shifts after incidents where drowsy sentries misidentified workers approaching barricades. Communist patrols noted increased desertion attempts by auxiliary police seeking amnesty. Screening teams processed applicants with questions about postings, weapons, and pay receipts. Japanese entries described anxiety over separation of families during embarkation and relief when lists confirmed group movement by unit hospital admissions, rose for strains and minor fractures among dock laborers as workload peaked. Canteens added hot meals to reduce fainting during long shifts. Resistance and countermeasures remained constrained by policy. Nationalist commanders prohibited punitive expeditions beyond the urban edge to avoid clashes that might halt harbor operations, relying instead on escorted sorties to recover municipal records or technicians. Communist headquarters forbade demolitions of major bridges that would impede future logistics, instructing sapper teams to favor obstacles that could be removed within hours. Allied rules barred armed Chinese formations from entering Japanese cantonments or ordnance compounds. Violations drew immediate escorts back to unit lines. Japanese officers enforced curfews and reported breaches to liaison officers rather than acting independently. Improvisation extended to communications. Field telephones ran along rooftop lines to avoid street damage. Messengers used bicycles with wooden rims to conserve scarce rubber. Signal flags backed up sirens at the harbor when power flickered. Outside the city, runners carried sealed slips with countersigned times to synchronize grain convoys with checkpoint duty rosters. When storms interrupted radio, minesweepers used lamp signaling at prearranged times to coordinate channel clearance with tug dispatch. Civilians adapted through cooperative structures. Market guilds set price ceilings for staple goods to reduce panic buying. Neighborhood committees organized night watches to deter theft at warehouses. Schools staggered sessions so older students could assist as clerks. Faith organizations and charities reopened soup lines with rice from municipal stores and donations from rural parishes. Petition boxes appeared at tram depots and police stations, and weekly tallies were forwarded to civil affairs offices, producing minor adjustments in curfew hours and ration pickup points. By late October, resistance and adaptation had produced a functional equilibrium short of open battle. The port worked under an urban regime that mixed nationalist administration and Allied supervision. Japanese units labored and waited under rules that emphasized records and order. The countryside remained under communist checkpoints and rotating patrols. Each actor had modified methods, patrol rhythms, convoy discipline, porter rotations, medical routines, and claims processes to endure the strain. The adjustments preserved capability but carried cumulative costs in fuel, labor, and time, setting the stage for a decisive shift if any party sought to convert administrative leverage into territorial control. The turning point came when schedules collided with territorial claims. In early November, a nationalist order redirected 2 battalions and 4 engineer companies inland to reopen the railway toward Jinan within 72 hours. The plan required a continuous convoy of coal, timber, and bridge parts from the docks to the railhead. Communist headquarters, reading the movement as a bid to project authority beyond the city, expanded road guards and announced that any heavy cargo would require inspection and escort outside the urban boundary Allied staff, focused on repatriation timelines, issued a notice limiting armed Chinese escorts on piers and along the inner cordon to avoid interference with embarkations. On day 1, 40 trucks and 90 handcarts formed at dawn near the freight yard. Manifests listed rails, fish plates, cable drums, and rations. At the northern checkpoint, communist guards requested offloading for inventory under the new procedure. Nationalist officers presented sealed manifests and argued that delays would miss bridge windows upriver. After an hour of negotiation, a split was arranged. 20 trucks passed with sealed hoods under liaison escort, while the remaining vehicles diverted to a side yard for sampling. The queue reached 2 kilometers. By mid-afternoon, rain turned shoulders to mud. Carts bogged and tempers frayed. 2 shots were fired when a sentry halted laborers trying to push through with cable drums. No casualties were recorded, but the convoy halted for the day. On day 2, nationalist headquarters attempted a flanking solution by sending a lighter column along the coastal road under naval police borrowed from the harbor. Communist patrols shadowed the movement and flagged that the escort violated the standing rule against transferring weapons to non-designated units. A standoff followed at a bridge with load limits posted during the war. Engineers argued the structure would take the weight. Road guards insisted on stage crossings with inspections. While officers conferred, villagers gathered, concerned about damage to a span that linked markets on both banks. The crossing proceeded, but at reduced tempo. The convoy reached only the first planned depot before dusk. Inside the port, the friction produced an administrative shift. Allied harbor control, citing congestion from delayed convoys, resequenced pier space, repatriation shipping first, ordnance collection second, municipal cargo third, and inland reconstruction last. Nationalist planners recalculated and found that rail repairs would slip beyond 7 days without priority access. Communist headquarters reported that inspection regimes had held and proposed formalizing escorts to prevent confrontations at every gate. Japanese cantonments logged the slowdown in outbound embarkations as lighters were reassigned, extending time in camp for several units. The decisive move occurred on day 3 when Allied Civil Affairs convened a joint session with nationalist city authorities and communist liaison officers. Minutes recorded a provisional protocol. Within the urban perimeter, defined by listed streets in the tram loop, nationalist administration would conduct searches and move cargo under Allied oversight. Beyond that line, convoys would present manifests at 3 designated gates, accept mixed escort teams, and adhere to speed and load limits posted by road boards. In exchange, road guards would guarantee time windows for inland movements totaling 8 hours per day, with penalties for missed slots recorded in ledger entries countersigned by all parties. Compliance was tested immediately. A pilot convoy of 12 trucks carrying rails and 2 ambulances carrying medical supplies departed under the new rules. At the first gate, manifests were stamped. 2 vehicles were diverted for weighing. 1 cart was rejected for excess load. The rest passed with an escort of 8 guards, 2 clerks, and 1 interpreter. The column reached the temporary depot before dusk. The return leg brought 30 tons of grain allocated to urban rations, logged against village quotas. The movement demonstrated that throughput, while reduced, could be predictable if schedules were kept. Civilian reaction marked the inflection. Market prices for rice eased slightly as grain inbound under the protocol reached city stores. Tram intervals stabilized when police redirected traffic away from the cordon during convoy windows. Petition counts at the claims desk dropped for 3 days as pier accidents declined with lighter crowds. Dockside labor committees reported improved meal distribution once repatriation and sailings resumed their published cadence. Yet the protocol also fixed a political geography. The urban zone, with piers, utilities, and police stations, operated under nationalist rules and Allied supervision. The approaches, with bridges and villages, remained under communist checkpoints and clerks. Japanese units, confined to cantonments and pierheads, continued inventories and embarkations by list. Each party gained predictability, but conceded freedom of action. Nationalists accepted inspection and timed gates. Communists promised transit slots and reduced ad hoc seizures. Allied staff took responsibility for enforcing pier priorities that could draw criticism from both Chinese sides. For the rank and file, the shift registered in routines. Nationalist patrols received laminated route cards matching gate windows. Communist escorts carried stamped slips with convoy serials. Marine shore patrols updated their translated boards with the new rules. Japanese officers briefed troops on changes to pier access during embarkations. The risk of a sudden clash diminished, but margins for error narrowed. A missed window stranded convoys overnight at gates. A broken bridge plank halted an entire day's schedule. A storm that forced transports to sea reset pier allocations and rippled through the plan. By week's end, the turning point was evident in ledgers rather than headlines. Inland rail repairs advanced in measured increments. Urban rations stabilized at posted scales. Repatriation tallies resumed a steady climb. Rural quotas adjusted to account for grain sent to city stores. Territory did not change hands through assault, yet authority clarified through procedures, signatures, and cues, shifting momentum from improvisation toward rule-bound control that each side intended to leverage in the final phase. Combat operations never peaked into a pitched battle. The end came as schedules closed. Through mid to late November 1945, repatriation sailings departed at regular intervals under Allied control. Japanese units marched by companies from cantonments to the pierheads, stacked kit against marked lines, and embarked by roster weapons, remained under seal in ordnance compounds for later disposition. Medical teams inspected each draft. Men unfit to travel were held for additional care and placed on subsequent lists. Camp perimeters contracted as headcounts dropped, freeing sheds for municipal use. Nationalist authorities formalized transfer of public services inside the urban perimeter. Police precincts assumed full responsibility for curfew enforcement and market regulation. Military police withdrew from several intersections as traffic normalized. Railway engineers declared the freight yard operational for scheduled departures at posted tonnage per day, with coal and construction materials prioritized for inland repair. The cable station returned to civilian operators under government oversight. Customs receipts restarted, and municipal tax offices reopened, issuing stamped vouchers for utilities and shop licenses. Communist commands adjusted by thinning forward posts and rotating units to other sectors. Checkpoints at the 3 designated gates continued to stamp manifests and assign escorts, but patrols beyond those points redeployed to districts where the railway network offered fewer alternatives. Political officers shifted focus from immediate inspections to consolidating village committees and rural courts. Intelligence sections continued to record cargo flows and personnel movements from the city, but avoided confrontations that might jeopardize the gate protocol. The humanitarian ledger reflected the strain of transition. Civil affairs teams processed claims for requisitioned carts, damaged storefronts, and accidental injuries on piers and roads. Hospitals saw a decline in dockside accidents as rush schedules eased, but admissions for respiratory illness rose with colder weather in unheated housing, soup kitchens, supported by city stores and donations from rural parishes, distributed fixed ladle measures per person per day. School attendance climbed as messenger duties were curtailed and as tram service stabilized along the dock line. Security incidents tapered, but did not disappear. Police logs recorded thefts of coal and cable from storage yards and several arrests for forging convoy passes. Outside the urban boundary, road guards reported a handful of skirmishes with armed bands unaligned with any command, dispersed by combined patrols. Japanese diaries noted isolated cases of bartering for food or cigarettes despite orders. Such breaches drew reprimands and, in some instances, docked rations. Allied summaries marked a steady decline in curfew violations and fewer disputes at pier gates once the multilingual regulations were posted at tram stops and markets. Withdrawal created administrative vacancies and competition. Nationalist civil offices advertised posts for clerks, mechanics, and power station workers. Preference lists favored pre-war employees who could present papers. Labor committees negotiated wage scales indexed to rice rations and to housing vouchers. Rural authorities published exemptions for technicians willing to service mills and substations outside the city. The result was a circulation of skilled workers in both directions, moderated by the predictability of the gate windows and the availability of escorts. Mine clearance and harbor safety entered routine status. Minesweepers continued patterned runs at high and low water, lifting or marking remnants cataloged in Japanese charts. Tugs resumed commercial towing under harbor control. Pilotage remained compulsory for ships entering the buoyed channel. Fishing cooperatives reopened inshore grounds under daylight-only permits. Coastal villages reported gradual recovery of catch volumes as cleared lanes expanded. By early December, the port's repatriation mission had processed the bulk of the garrison, with remaining personnel concentrated in 2 camps. Pending shipping ordnance compounds kept weapons crated for later disposal under Allied direction. Inventories were cross-checked against earlier Japanese lists and updated as late turn-ins arrived from police boxes and workshops. The airfield supported limited movements tied to harbor operations. Surplus equipment was tagged for transfer to municipal stores or returned to ordnance custody. The immediate political consequence was a layered occupation rather than a conquest. Inside the urban perimeter, nationalist administration operated courts, schools, utilities, and transport with Allied supervision on matters affecting repatriation and disarmament. Outside, communist structures governed roads, bridges, and village markets through pass systems, tax ledgers, and escorts. Lines on maps were less decisive than lines of procedure. Pier allocations, gate windows, stamped manifests, and posted rules. Civilians navigated these with ration books, work badges, and route cards. Casualty accounting closed with modest figures relative to large campaigns, reflecting the absence of major engagements. Police and hospital registers listed the dead and wounded from accidents, brief exchanges at roadblocks, and isolated clashes without comprehensive public totals. Property loss was measured in tonnage of pilfered coal and cable, in broken axles, and in damaged bridge planks. Compensation boards issued receipts and partial payments as budgets allowed. As Japanese embarkations neared completion, Allied authorities prepared to scale down. Shore patrols transferred select duties to municipal police. Civil affairs closed the claims desk in stages, forwarding unresolved petitions to city offices. Remaining liaison teams focused on document archiving, charts, inventories, and minutes that recorded how control had passed through signatures rather than assaults. The city entered a new phase defined by Chinese political competition, conducted under the shadow of a receding Allied mission, and the memory of a garrison that had left by ship rather than by siege. The formal after-action tallies would appear not in casualty columns, but in schedules met, convoys passed, and public services that stayed on despite the strain. The long-term significance of the Tsingtao episode lay in procedures rather than battles. The port became a case study in how capitulation, disarmament, and repatriation could be executed through timetables, manifests, and mixed liaison boards. Allied documents preserved charts of cleared channels, serial lists of weapons under seal, and embarkation rosters. Japanese unit histories and surrender inventories recorded cantonment headcounts, medical inspections, and the sequence of embarkations. Municipal ledgers tracked the reopening of utilities, wage tables for dock labor, and compensation receipts for requisitioned carts and damaged goods. Together, these records established a traceable chain of custody for people, equipment, and property. For the nationalist government, Tsingtao demonstrated that an urban core linked to sealift could be held even when the hinterland was contested. Courts, schools, customs, and tram service resumed under a guarded routine. Rail and cable nodes functioned with escorts and posted gate windows. The limitation was equally clear. Sustained projection inland required more shipping, fuel, and trained staff than allocations permitted. For communist headquarters, the episode validated a method of pressure through roads, bridges, tax ledgers, and escorts rather than direct assaults on a fortified port. The gate protocol, stamped manifests, mixed escorts, timed passage, offered leverage over flows without owning the keys. Internationally, the port served as a temporary Allied base for disarmament and repatriation, then as a hub supporting broader North China missions. Mine-sweeping patterns, pilotage rules, and pier allocations from this period influenced procedures at other ports facing similar tasks. Allied units withdrew as repatriation concluded, and as Chinese authorities assumed full responsibility for public order and services inside the urban perimeter. The civilian legacy was measured in resumed routines and in vulnerabilities revealed. Price boards, ration books, and tram timetables stabilized urban life. Claims boards institutionalized compensation for accidents and requisitions. At the same time, the reliance on timed gates, escorts, and posted rules underscored how easily shocks, storms, bridge damage, or missed convoys could ripple through food, power, and transport. Strategically, Tsingtao foreshadowed the next phase of the Chinese Civil War, a port city under nationalist administration, and an encircling countryside under communist structures prefigured later contests over rail junctions, river crossings, and coastal enclaves. The city changed hands in 1949 when communist forces entered Qingdao after negotiated withdrawals and limited resistance. The procedures and contacts built in 1945, clerks, pilots, technicians, facilitated another transfer organized largely through lists and notices. Historiography treats the event with varied emphasis. Some studies highlight the absence of major engagements and the primacy of administrative control. Others focus on the port's value in North China, logistics, and on the interactions among Chinese factions under Allied oversight. Japanese sources center on camp life, medical routines, and embarkation. Allied files emphasize minesweeping, pier safety, and the neutrality rules governing Chinese formations. Chinese municipal and provincial records trace labor markets, wage scales, and the reactivation of utilities. Commemoration has followed these lines of evidence. Maritime museums display harbor charts and mine-sweeping gear. Local archives preserve tram tickets, ration books, and employment rolls. Cemeteries and memorials mark deaths from accidents and isolated clashes. Japanese Veterans Associations compile lists of units and sailing dates. The language of memory often returns to procedures, windows, cues, stamps, and signatures, because they determined outcomes more than gunfire. Thus, the Siege of 1945 ended not by storming walls, but by exhausting schedules, repatriation completed, weapons sealed and inventoried, utilities functioning under watch, and gates regulating movement between city and countryside. Its legacy is a template for transition in coastal cities at war's end, showing how power can be exercised through control of flows, documentation, and routine, and how such control can shift with a new set of rosters, escorts, and posted rules.